Hi, perhaps you recognize me. It's your favorite president.
We will decide who comes to this country and the circumstances in which they come.
I mean,
You know you want to ban our national flags, but we're going to wave you goodbye.
What does confrontational mean? It means you fight for what you believe.
Enough was enough! And I said, let Trump-a-mania run wild, brother!
It is not merely our privilege to be strong, it is our duty to be strong.
Hello everyone, welcome to Commanding the Narrative. My name is Stephen Tripp. Thank you to everyone who is watching this live on Rumble, Facebook, and yes, we are back on YouTube after some censorship going on. So for everyone that are watching this live, you can contribute to the chat and be part of this discussion today. We have a great guest on, and if you're watching this in future, please follow us and subscribe and like and comment as well. I love to hear the comments from our wonderful audience. But I'll kick things off just quickly because I do want to get into it today, but I do need to let you know how you can support Commanding the Narrative. It is by heading to Buy Me a Coffee. If you want to throw us a few dollars there, it helps to pay for the stream, helps to pay for the website, and also, most importantly, it gives me a warm and fuzzy feeling inside. So that's always good and much appreciated. Also, if you want to stay up to date with everything that we're doing at Commanding the Narrative or the ex-candidates or Global Discussion Forum, any of the articles that I might write or events coming up, head to commandingthenarrative.com. Very easy to remember, commandingthenarrative.com. Top right-hand corner, you can hit the sign up button and you'll get a weekly newsletter. That newsletter will detail everything that's happening throughout the last week or anything that's coming up, big events or anything like that. So that's probably the best way of keeping up to date. Don't rely on social media. We definitely can't. So please head straight to the website and hit that sign up button, commandingthenarrative.com. And lastly, a big event coming up in Guildford on September 29th. It is the Environment and Energy Forum. We have Di Lee locked in, the federal member for Fowler. She's going to be speaking. A host of other speakers, Matthew Kamanzuli, Sandra Burke, who's now the new spokeswoman for Advance Australia, Craig Kelly, Steve Christou, Dr. Mark Ho from the Australian Nuclear Association. Nick Cater will be there live streaming to ADH TV and a host of other speakers as well. So get your tickets now. You can head to Eventbrite and find those tickets there. And I'll also post the links in the show notes as well. So we can get a big crowd out there at Guildford. Guildford is within Chris Bowen's electorate of McMahon. So if you can get there and make a statement, we'd love to see you there. I think it's very important that we make that statement in Chris Bowen's electorate and push back on all the stuff that the Labor government are rolling out currently. And we can talk about that today because I have a very special guest. He is the chairman of the New South Wales National Party. He was also a member of the New South Wales Legislative Council for 19 years between the year 2000 and 2019. His name is Rick Colless. Welcome to Commanding the Narrative, Rick.
thank you, Steve. Good to be with you.
Good to be with you, mate. I met you out at Oberon a weekend or two ago at the symposium that we had there. It was a pleasure to meet you, and it was good to see that the Nationals are getting involved with their local communities on important issues. But just on you particularly, just a bit of your background first. As I said, you were in the New South Wales Parliament for almost 20 years, which is significant. But in my research, I found that you weren't the first member of your family to be in the New South Wales Parliament. You actually had a great-great-grandfather and a great-great-uncle in the Parliament as well. Is that right?
That is right, yes. My great-great-grandfather was Richard Hargrave, and my middle name is Hargrave. And my two given names are Richard Hargrave, and the family name is Colless. But Richard Hargrave was the first member for New England and Macleay, as it was called in those days. And he served in that role. He lived in Armidale, or at Hillgrove Station, which is between Armidale and Dorrigo. And he was the member up there for a number of years. His brother was also in the Legislative Council in a similar period. We're talking about the 1850s, before Federation. So it was long before there was an Australian government per se. but it was all New South Wales, of course, at that time, right across Australia, what we now know as Australia.
And how did you feel walking into the Parliament for the first time as a member of Parliament, knowing that you had this family connection there? Was that significant for you?
It certainly was, and the Legislative Council chamber is the oldest parliamentary chamber in Australia. It was formed in 1824. In fact, 2 weeks ago, we had a commemorative dinner there in the Legislative Council, or in the Parliament of New South Wales, to commemorate the 200 years of the creation of the Legislative Council. So knowing that some of my ancestors had served in that Parliament all those years ago, when I first walked into that chamber, it was a very emotional moment to know that my ancestors had actually stood in that very same place, debating very similar issues to what we ended up debating while I was in there.
No, that's a pretty wild story. I mean, great grandfather to have a connection there in this country as well. I mean, it only goes to show that you've have a heritage in this country for a long time. But when you stepped into the political realm, why did you choose the National Party?
Well, I've always lived in regional New South Wales. I was born in Tamworth. My family had a property near Inverell in those days, at a little place called Bundara, or Bendemeer. When I was born, we actually lived on Bendemeer Station, which is quite an historic property right on the highway at Bendemeer, and you can still see the signs there at Bendemeer Station as you go along the highway. When that was sold up, my mum and dad bought a place up near Bundara, and that's essentially where I grew up. I was there from when I was 3 till the time I was 15 or 16, I think, when we finally sold that property. So we'd always been involved in agriculture. My father was principally a grazier, running sheep and cattle, and I grew up with the understanding that people needed to look after the country, needed to look after the regional areas, and the National Party, or the Country Party as it was in those days, seemed to be a natural fit if ever I decided to go into politics.
You said something there about like protecting agriculture and grazing land and country areas. I think it is important because so much of our wealth in this country, and not just that, just putting food on the table and those sorts of things, it's incredibly important to the nation. But unfortunately, as you would know, the New South Wales Parliament and also the federal Parliament are congested with city MPs. This is a point that I've been making for a long time. From your experience of being in the Parliament for 20 years, amongst other members of Parliament that were from the city, do you think they understand the country and farming and those issues?
That's a very good question, Steve, and I think the short answer is no, they don't. But look, going back to when I was a young boy, we had cousins that lived in the city. Most people that lived in the country had cousins that lived in the city. And in the early 50s, mid-50s, most people that lived in the city had cousins or relatives or friends that lived in the country. And there was I can recall having our city cousins come and stay on the farm with us during school holidays and that sort of thing, to give them a bit of an experience and an understanding of what actually happens in regional New South Wales. That I don't think that happens anymore, or certainly doesn't happen to the same extent. Most people that live in the city are cityfied people. They very rarely come out west of the range, and if they do, it's more as a tourism thing, to go to the wineries at Orange, for example, or some local event that's in the country, rather than actually going out and having a look at what happens on farms. And I think that's a shame. The old saying that city kids think milk comes out of a bottle is so true, because how many 12-year-old kids today have ever milked a cow, for example? And I grew up milking the cow from the time I was big enough to hold a bucket. So I think that's something that is a problem with the way society is structured today, that people just don't have a good enough understanding of where their food comes from and how it's grown and so on. And those are very important things. If people want to keep having 3 square meals a day, they've got to understand that where the food comes from is something they really should appreciate.
Mate, I'm almost 40 years old. I wouldn't know how to milk a cow or shear a sheep or anything like that. But look, I did go out to Oberon, as I mentioned in the beginning. We had that symposium out there 2 weekends ago. That's where I met you.
Yes.
Why did you give up your time on a Saturday to attend that symposium?
Well, it's about the renewable energy and the climate change forum, and so that was a big part of it. I also happened to know one of the speakers there pretty well, and I was keen to catch up with him. And of course, he's written a lot of books, and we're talking about Ian Plimer, of course.
Yeah.
We had a number of seminars with him while I was in the Parliament to try and get people to understand the geological aspects or the geological time aspects of the whole climate story, rather than just what's happening within a few years. And Ian Plimer puts that across very succinctly about it is the geological timescale. These things have changed so many times over that time period. And so I was keen to catch up with him, but also I want to keep a tab on what's going on within the renewable energy area. There's some things there that I'm really concerned about in terms of what it's doing to the landscape itself and the soils and the vegetation resources, all things that are important. And I think most people understand the importance of, certainly the farming community do, because that's their lifeblood. And when they see things happening that's destroying their base resource, which is their land and their soil, obviously they're very concerned about it.
No, look, if anyone wants to watch that symposium, you can head to Chris Covery's YouTube channel and find that symposium. As Rick said, Professor Ian Plimer spoke there. Also, Dr. Alan Moran spoke. A host of great speakers. Craig Kelly was there. Grant Piper from the National Rational Energy Network. Paul Vallejo did a little talk on nuclear energy. So there's a lot of great information from that symposium. A lot of people came up to me afterwards and said, wow, that was really fantastic. Thankfully, they were so glad that we recorded it. So there's a copy of it. So there was so much information that was presented. A lot of people said, now we have a record, we can go through it and take out the good bits and, and really try and absorb everything that was said. But Rick, did you get any takeaways from what was said on the day?
Well, as I said, I always take something away from Ian Plimer, and I've heard him speak a number of times, and he was fantastic. I thought Paul Vallejo was excellent in his understanding and the way he described the nuclear industry and how we can proceed with that, and I'm very interested in that as well. I had the opportunity years ago to have a couple of visits out to Lucas Heights nuclear reactor, and when I'm talking to people about nuclear, I can say to them, well, have you ever stood on top of a nuclear reactor? And of course I have, because I've been to Lucas Heights, and Lucas Heights is what they call an open pool reactor. So it doesn't have a lid on it. It's just a big pool of water that you can actually stand on top of on the observation deck and look down into the pool of water. And down there you see where all the rods are and all the nuclear activities happening. And I also know the previous managing or CEO of Lucas Heights, a bloke by the name of Dr. Addy Patterson, and I was talking to him only a couple of months ago about what was happening in the nuclear industry, and I asked him a question. I said, "So how much radiation would I have received by standing on top of that reactor, looking down into that pool while it was working?" And this came up the other day at Oberon too, which I thought was very interesting. And he made the comment that there's more radioactivity in 2 bananas than there are coming out of that nuclear reactor. And that's, of course, because of the radioactive isotope of potassium that's in bananas. So it's stories like that I think we really need to get out and get people understanding. So that was an important thing for me to take away from that, was to hear Paul talk about the same sorts of things that I've heard Addy Patterson talk about, And we need to be listening to nuclear experts in that space, not the Chris Bowens of the world who just appear not to have any understanding of nuclear processes at all.
You know, I'm incredibly lucky to be friends with Paul, so I can pick his brain all the time. And I've had him on this podcast plenty of times to talk about it. And it seems to me that the more that you scratch beneath the surface of nuclear energy, the more attractive it is, the more you're convinced that it's the way to go. On the flip side of that, the more that you scratch underneath the surface of renewable energy, the more like environmental destruction you see, and the expense of it all, and even some of the horrific human rights stuff, like the Uyghurs in Japan. Sorry, not Japan. The Uyghurs in China being used as slave labor or child labor in the Congo to mine cobalt and those sorts of issues. You yourself have some expertise when it comes to soil, and I've been hearing a lot about concerns about solar panels and also these wind turbines leaching into the soil and causing trouble with agricultural land. What can you tell us about that?
Well, my background in soil science is that I was a cadet with the what was called the Soil Conservation Service when I first left Hawkesbury Ag College in what seems to be more than half a lifetime ago now, nearly a whole lifetime ago. But I spent 25 years working with the Soil Conservation Service, preventing land degradation and helping farmers understand processes and all that sort of stuff. And what I'm seeing now is that some of these developments that are going on in this renewable energy space, and I'll talk firstly about the solar panel. I refuse to call them farms because they're not farms; they're industrial installations. But in terms of the soil itself, there's within the soil science industry, we talk about land classes or soil and land classes. So class 1 land is the best agricultural land you could find, flat land with very good soils on it that have a very high agricultural value. So there's 1, 2, and 3, and 4 are the best of the agricultural soils in Australia. Or in New South Wales. Let's talk about New South Wales principally because that's where I spent most of my years working. And land classes 5 to 8 get progressively of lower agricultural value. So it's a combination of things like soil types, slopes, topography, terrain, all those sorts of things come into play. So where a solar farm or a solar installation is proposed on classes 1 to 4 land, they require a full soil survey across the whole site, down to a depth of about 500 to 600 millimetres, to understand what the surface soils are like in terms of their value for agriculture, but also an understanding of the subsoils and how suitable they may be for heavy industry. The problem arises where we get into particularly the class 5 land, which can be as low a slope as some of the class 3, 4 land. In other words, it's gently undulating country that we see a lot of in the Central West. But if it's class 5 and gently undulating like that, it's because there's a very poor soil type underneath it. And I've done a few assessments of land and soil for some of these solar developments, and I've looked at a lot of others that I haven't actually had an input into, but there's one in particular, and I'm going to name it because it's something that I think is very bad, and it's going to be bad for the community out there, and that's the Birrawa solar farm or solar installation, which is halfway between Gulgong and Dunedoo in the Central West. And it's right in the middle of the Central West renewable energy zone, which basically extends from Coolah in the east to Dubbo in the west. Huge area of land. And this soil, this country there is all about, it's less than 3 or 4% slope, which means that it's for every 100 metres, there's a 3 metre rise on the slope. So it's generally country that would handle a lot of farming and agriculture, but it's class 5 land. It's been classed as class 5. When you look at the reason for that, It's what they call a sodic soil under it. In other words, it's high in sodium at depth. So most farmers that are listening would understand what I'm talking about, and they're commonly called spewy soil. So that when they get wet, if you drive over them, you just bog to the axle straight away. You can't move on them. They get very, very boggy. And the reason for that is that when they get wet, the structural strength of the soil dissipates due to the high sodium levels in the soil. So in the case of the Birrua site, being a class 5, they, under the solar guidelines, they didn't have to do a full soil survey. And in that particular case, I can see what's going to happen there. Under those panels, under each row of panels, they dig a trench about 500 millimetres deep to put all their cabling in for the solar panels. So what happens in those soils when they get wet, if they're disturbed like that, they become susceptible to tunnel erosion. And what could easily happen in that situation is that a tunnel will form along those channels, and the whole thing could collapse on itself, basically. So that's one aspect of it, is getting a full understanding of what the soil types are in those areas across all developments, not just where it's better agricultural land where they've got to do it, but they need to be doing it on the not so good agricultural land too, because that means there could well be soil constraints there. The second thing is the posts that they mount the solar panels on are C-section steel purlins that have been treated with zinc to prevent the corrosion of that metal. So most people understand that as what we call, I'm having a mental blank here. Doesn't matter, I'll think of it in a minute. But what happens is that when you put those posts into the ground, galvanised, that's the word I was looking for, galvanised steel posts, which are a C-section steel. So they're about 200 millimetres by 100 millimetres open steel section. And they hammer them into the ground to a depth of about 2 metres at least, and then mount the solar panels on those C-section things. The zinc that's on them, there's about 1 millimetre of zinc that's electroplated on the outside of that steel to prevent it rusting in the ground. Most people that have driven around the bush would have seen old wool sheds, for example, that had galvanised corrugated iron on their roof. And after about 50 or 60 years, that galvanising starts to wear off and the roof starts to go rusty. And any old hay shed or wool shed around New South Wales, you'll see them everywhere. So when you put that galvanising into the soil where it's wet, it could be salty, it could be acid, that galvanising wears off a lot faster. So it may only last, and depend entirely on the soil type, may only last 15 to 20 years before the post itself starts to rust.
Wow. So they always talk about these solar panels lasting 20 years. What you're saying is the posts might even just last 15 years and they'll just fall over?
Exactly. But more serious than that even is what that amount of zinc does to the soil. Now, from a soil nutrition perspective, zinc is a trace element that is deficient in most Australian soils. And I've done thousands of soil tests around the countryside, and I could count on one hand the number of them that have enough zinc in them for proper plant growth. So it's a very important element, trace element, only required in tiny amounts. So the normal level of zinc that's required in the soil is probably, and again, depends on the soil type, between 5 and 20 kilos of zinc per hectare. So it's not very much when you look at the area of a hectare. We're only talking about a very small amount in the soil itself. So these posts, when they hammer them in, are covered in zinc, and the amount of zinc that they're putting on is around probably from 1,200 kilos to 1,500 kilos of zinc per hectare. Now that's a lot more than what the soil needs, a lot more than what plants and animals need in their diets. But when you get in excess of about 200 kilos of zinc in 1 hectare, it becomes toxic and it prevents the uptake of things like phosphorus and iron, which are essential elements also for plant growth. And if plants can't get phosphorus, they die. So we could easily see a whole area under these solar panels that become toxic due to zinc pollution in the soil. And that's one of the things that there hasn't been any research done on by any of these companies. It's never addressed in their EISs. And I raised it at a public meeting about the Birrawa site, and it just wasn't listened to. They didn't pay any attention to it at all.
See, this is the big problem, and it goes back to what I said before. I mean, most of the politicians pushing this stuff are in city electorates. You know, I try and list them all the time. You know, Tanya Plebiscite in Sydney, Anthony Albanese in Grainler, Chris Bowen in McMahon, all the teals along the coast of Sydney or down in Melbourne in Kooyong and places like that. What would they know about soils and zinc affecting soils or anything of that nature? Yeah. When you were in the Parliament, were you asked? Did any of them knock on your door and say, "Rick, can you tell us about the soil and what these projects might do to our agricultural land?"
Well, they quite often didn't have to knock on my door because I'd be knocking on their door to try and alert them to some of these issues. And to their credit, some of the Labor Party people understood where I was coming from, particularly those that had some knowledge of what was happening west of the range in the regional areas. But people like the Greens, no appreciation of those sort of issues at all. And really, from an environmental perspective, this is what really annoys me. From an environmental perspective, that's a really important issue for them that they should be grasping onto.
Well, look, the Greens would blow up if you tried to clear some land to build a footpath somewhere. But when it comes to clearing land for wind turbines and solar panels, you don't get a peep out of them.
No, you don't. And we've seen all the footage of what's happening in North Queensland at the moment with some of the turbine developments up there. Yep. They're clearing huge tracts of land. Most of these things are on ridges and steep country and so on. And just the excavation that they have to make, they can be removing 4,000 or 5,000 cubic metres of earth and rock to build their platforms to stand these things on. And then, of course, they're pouring thousands of tonnes of concrete and steel into the base, which they say is going to stay there. Once the thing's decommissioned, they'll remove the tower, but the concrete base will remain there. It's a bit scary to think what could be happening in 40 to 50 to 100 years' time in some of these things where these degradation issues actually come to manifest themselves.
And one of the other things I've heard about when it comes to solar panels is they get very hot, like in the middle of the day when the sun's out. And I guess that's the only time they'd be working, but it gets very hot, and then the ground underneath, you need to turn the soil a lot of the time to keep it fertile and full of nutrients or whatever. I'm certainly not an expert. This is what I've heard, and with that heat and not turning the soil, it actually bakes the soil, and that makes it barren as well. Is that true? Is there any truth behind that?
Look, I think the jury's still out on that a bit, because there's other arguments that are coming forward that's saying the fact that it gets shaded by the panels actually keeps it cooler and softer. But I have an issue with the way they manage their vegetation under those panels, because it's either got to be slashed to keep it short to reduce the fire risk, or they run sheep under it to keep it short to reduce the fire risk. So if you how can I say this? If a plant grows to a height of say 30 centimetres, then in round figures, it's going to have 30 centimetres of roots underneath it. And as it's clipped, particularly if it's clipped regularly, like every time a little shoot appears, it gets bitten off by a sheep, then the roots also contract. So that means that it's not getting access to the water that's under the ground. So it becomes, it goes into a drought situation faster. If they were slashing that, it means that the plant would be allowed to grow maybe to 200 or 300 millimetres before they run the slasher over it, which means that the roots would be down a little bit deeper, meaning that they would have more drought tolerance than they would otherwise. So there's a whole industry, agricultural grazing industry, that revolves around that issue now, and it's called holistic management or time-controlled grazing. There's a number of names for it. But basically what it means is that instead of letting your stock run at a set stock rate over a big area all the time, like putting 100 sheep into one paddock and leaving them there forever, that you would put 100 sheep into 1 acre and move them every day or every second day, so that they go in and they graze the pasture off very close to the ground. The roots are still down roughly to the same height that the pasture was when the sheep or cattle went in there. So it responds fast, it gets growing again, the roots survive, so the pasture becomes more productive. That's the theory. In a set stock situation where the fresh shoots are getting bitten off all the time, then the roots contract. So you don't get the same productivity, you don't get the same rooting depth of the plant. And that has all sorts of other implications in terms of the dryland salinity issue, which is dryland salinity is not actually a salt problem, as the name suggests. It's a water problem. And what it means is that water accumulates in the lower parts of the catchment because it's not being extracted by deep-rooted vegetation higher up in the catchment. So what we find is that where that water accumulates in the lower parts of the landscape, it evaporates, and when it evaporates, it leaves a lot of the salts that are there in the soil at the surface of the soil, which eventually kills the plants. And if you drive around the Central West, you'll see these patches of this everywhere, if you know what you're looking for. Some of them are really, really obvious. There's white crusted salt on it. And others just I can detect them when there's a change in the vegetation as the salt tolerant species become more abundant in that particular area. You can tell that there's a change happening there, and there's probably a high water table there, which is going to eventually cause dryland salinity to occur. So in those situations, particularly with the solar developments, where they're putting all these panels in, on some of it on quite low sloping country, down into the valleys, and the one near Wellington is a classic example of that. I suspect in a few years' time we'll see some really serious dryland salinity issues appearing in some of those lower parts of those solar developments. Keeping in mind what I said about the effect of salty soils on the galvanised posts, that's going to speed up that process of the whole thing collapsing eventually into an unmitigated disaster.
Wow. Look, the information that we get here in the cities is this is all green. It's green. It's green energy. It's renewable. It's fantastic. It's wonderful. I mean, people in the country, farmers that are listening to this are probably just nodding their heads, going, "Yep, Rick's just pointing out the obvious." You must just be pulling your hair out, like seeing these projects pop up all around you and going, "Oh, why doesn't anyone listen?" Well,
the problem is that, and I was part of the government that agreed to the start of this renewable energy zone concept, but we had no idea at that time the extent to which it would develop, and certainly didn't envisage what's happening now, say in the Central West renewable energy zone. If you look at a map, as I said before, between Coolah and Dubbo, and I've got a map that shows the proposed developments that are going to occur in that area. It could be almost a complete carpet of either solar panels or wind turbines across that whole area, and it's going to have a huge cumulative impact. Some of these individual projects for the solar panels are 1,500 hectares, each, and we're talking that's nearly 3,000 hectares. In fact, it's more than 3,000 hectares. 3,000 acres. Sorry, it's more than 3,000 acres.
Yeah, well, the Central West Orana Renewable Energy Zone, which you're talking about, I got the map of it up here, is 20,000 square kilometres and takes in the towns of Gilgandra, Dunedoo, Coolah, Dubbo, Wellington, Mudgee. I mean, it's just an incredible scale and an incredible land footprint for this project. And there's another 4 of them elsewhere in the state.
That's right.
There's 5 renewable energy zones all up. So,
Yeah.
so what you're saying is that you had no idea that this was going to be
No,
the end.
and the government, the previous government at that stage, it wasn't on their radar to see that happen. Some people like Matt Keane may well have seen or known what was going to happen, or he was certainly pushing it. But see, that's part of the problem is we have those people in the cities, Matt Keane included, that doesn't understand what's happening west of the range. He's been out to Orange with me a few times, and we've done a couple of farm visits, but he doesn't really grasp what's going to occur when these large scale developments, 1,500 hectares each, just override everything. They're all regarded as state significant developments, so local councils have no capacity to try and halt them or have a proper assessment done under them. So it's as I say, it's heading towards an unmitigated disaster.
Speaking of city MPs, I mean, I've started saying this until I'm blue in the face, and as they say, once you start getting sick of saying something, that's when people start to listen. So I'll keep bringing this up over and over again. This is Zali Steggall's website, and on her very own website, under the policies section, where does she stand? It says, "I do not support wind farms along Warringa's beachfront." And then she goes on to say, "It's unfortunate that such an important issue as the climate crisis is trivialized by some and reduced to my personal use of solar panels, the car I drive, and a joke petition to put windmills on Manly Beach." Well, I say it may be a joke for Zali Steggall, but certainly not a joke for people in the country that are having to deal with these projects. How do you feel when you see that, I'm going to call it hypocrisy, of advocating for, she's advocating for a 75% reduction in emissions by 2035, which is going to include projects, as we've been talking about, solar projects, wind projects, but she doesn't want it in her backyard.
That's it. That's it entirely. And, well, if they're so good for the environment, why not put them in national parks and make them part of national parks? But that won't happen either, and we understand why it won't. But in terms of the wind development, there was a proposal that's been suggested, and that's all it is at this stage, is a suggestion that there should be one in the forests around Mount Canobolas. Now, they've already agreed to the forests around Oberon, as we talked about the other day, but there's also a proposal to put them on the around Mount Canobolas in the forestry areas there. If you look at Mount Canobolas, there's a series of 3 or 4 radio communication towers on the top of Mount Canobolas, and the tallest one of those is about 400 feet high. These new wind towers are going to be 400 meters high, more than 3 times the height of the towers that are currently on the top of Mount Canobolas. So people do not understand just the scale of these things and how visible they'll be from so far away, and they're all going to be on the tops of the high ridges where they get the wind. So they'll be visible for miles.
I do want to talk about that because it's very significant. But just quickly, I've got a comment here from Pauline. Hello, Pauline. Good to see you watching. Great information, RE Soils. Is there written articles out there that can be shared?
Look, there are, and what I might do is dig up some references along those lines. A lot of it is pretty complex scientific stuff, particularly when you get into the soil science side of it. But what we need to do is to have a look and find those articles that explain it in simple terms, so that people can understand that if there is an issue with respect to the soil and landscape factors in some of these developments, they shouldn't go ahead. They should be stopped at that point. But there doesn't seem to be any capacity to stop them, even when those sorts of things are there and they are a constraint.
Now, back to what we were just talking about, the scale of these projects, and we mentioned the Central West Arana Renewable Energy Zone is 20,000 square kilometres. I mean, I could list a whole bunch of other projects that are just as incredible in terms of size, and I've written articles about it and blah, blah, blah. But this is actually a document that was put out by the Victorian government in March 2022. It's the Offshore Wind Policy Directions paper. Now, basically, this has been deleted since off the Victorian website, but the Wayback Machine's been able to capture it, thank God. But what this policy booklet was trying to do was advocate why we need offshore wind. And basically the argument they were putting forward is that we don't have enough land to get to net zero with renewable energy. And if you come to this page 19, it says here that to get to net zero with wind and solar, they would need 70% of Victoria's agricultural land. I mean, it's an incredible amount of land, almost incomprehensible. And that's why they're saying, that's why we need offshore wind. And look, now there's an offshore wind project down in the Gippsland of Victoria that's going to be 15,000 square kilometers.
Yeah.
I mean, what are we doing, Rick? Where is this madness coming from?
How can these people actually believe what's coming out of their own mouths when they talk about this and write about this stuff? I mean, the same amount of power can be generated from a few hundred square meters with a nuclear reactor, and yet we're destroying most of Australia's agricultural land on the basis that we need the energy. Well, we do need the energy, but we don't need to destroy all our agricultural areas just to on the guise of having what's going to be ultimately really expensive power anyway.
Well, what would it do for food production if you lost 70% of agricultural land in, just say, Victoria?
Well, what it would mean is quite simple, really. 70% less food. I mean, that's the bottom line. Food and fibre together, not just food products, but also the wool and things like that to come off the sheep industry. So it's going to have a huge impact on where we get our food and fibre from. And I've heard people say, "Oh, we'll just import it." Hello. At the moment, we're exporting most of our food and fibre to feed the rest of the world.
Yeah, and they revere it. I've been to Hong Kong where they have Australian meat, and they put up big signs like it's something amazing.
Yeah, that's
and
right.
It is.
Yeah, very true.
Look, this is a massive issue, this renewable stuff, and we could talk about it all day. But I do want to shift and talk more specifically about the National Party, because I don't think the National Party gets talked about enough. I certainly haven't had the opportunity to interview someone from the National Party yet. You're the first cab off the rank, so thank you for coming on. But look, I think the National Party can play a significant role as part of the coalition. They almost, at least here in the city, get forgotten about. Most people talk about the Liberal government. Yeah. Well, it's the coalition governments. It's between the Nationals and the Liberal Party. If you look at the last federal election and the state election in New South Wales that the coalition lost, the National Party held up their end of the bargain. They didn't lose any seats. They managed to hold all their seats. Why is that? How can you explain that success?
Well, it's a good question, and we have lost seats at different times. There's no doubt about that. But I think the important thing is that we have a team of local members that are part of a team. And a lot of people say, "Oh, we should just vote for the best person," and yes, you should. But depending on where that best person may or may not sit is a very important issue as well. And a lot of people, and we've lost seats to independents over the years. A lot of people say that, "Oh, yes, but being an independent is the way to go," and so on. But the reality of it is that in Australia and in each state of Australia, we're either going to have a coalition-led or Liberal National Party type government or a Labor Greens type government. And if you have an independent in there, then that's one seat less than what the Liberal National Coalition might need to get the numbers to form government. Even though they might be an independent and they might vote with us most of the time, we're still going to have a Labor government in power. And that's not in the best interests of regional New South Wales or regional Australia, as we're seeing at the moment with all the folly that's happening, around the energy debate. So I think it's important that we understand that like or not like the National Party, that we still hold a huge swag of seats in New South Wales, both state and federally, that we need to hold in order to maintain a conservative government in Australia. So I think it's important that we're able to do that, and that's certainly been the power that we've had over the years is to be able to put together a group of people that are part of a very strong team, a united team that has a specific view of some of these issues. For example, the nuclear debate. It was David Littleproud that on behalf of the National Party that started that debate with Peter Dutton, and Peter Dutton ultimately has accepted the debate, and now it's become coalition policy. So that was the power. The same thing happened with the Voice debate.
Mm-hmm.
You know, it was the Nats that came out first against the Voice, and eventually the Libs came and joined us. And in my local federal seat of Colless, we had a National Party member here, in Andrew G, and he actually went independent on the basis that he didn't agree with the Voice. Well, he never said anything about the Voice in the Parliament. He didn't debate it in our party room. He didn't debate it on the floor of the Parliament. He just got up and left. Now, that to me was an act of treachery on the people that put him in there, because they put him in there knowing that he was part of a very strong national team that were going to debate these issues internally and then come out with a united position at the end of the day.
And it's funny, at the symposium in Oberon, he was invited to come and speak, and he apparently was unavailable. But when I was leaving Sunday morning, the day after, he mysteriously rocked up to snoop around. So
did he? Yeah.
There you go. But and look, I'm really glad that you brought up nuclear energy and the Voice and the national stance and how they swayed the Liberal Party, because there's so much focus on how the Greens sway the Labor Party.
Exactly.
There's not enough focus on how the National Party can sway the Liberal Party. How much? I mean, in my view, like a lot of the times, the Nationals, at least in the city, are viewed as a bit player of the coalition, but they're significant. They're a significant part of the coalition, and in a lot of ways, the Liberal Party need the National Party to be able to govern. They need the National Party, so they need to listen to the National Party. I mean, how much sway can the Nationals have over a potential coalition government?
It's a good question, and sometimes we don't always win our position. I've got to say that, and that's politics. That's the way the political system works. But very often we research our issues pretty carefully, like David Littleproud and his team did with the Voice federally, and also with the nuclear debate. I mean, it's been, the nuclear industry has been New South Wales Nationals policy for at least 10 years that I can recall, and very often gets debated at our annual conference, and it was again at our annual conference this year. It was debated again, and we put our full support behind it. Unanimously from the 250 odd delegates that were there. So that's the power that we have, that in the democratic process of going through that conference process, I suppose, which we have all our wider membership there to debate these issues, as well as the MPs and the party officials and so on. And as I say, for 10 years, it's been on our policy books that we should embrace nuclear, that we should get rid of the constraints and the restrictions on nuclear development in Australia, and that remains the case. We've still got to do that, but I think Littleproud and Dutton have come out and said that they're going to do it, and once we get back into government, it should be one of the first orders of business to remove those constraints on nuclear development in Australia.
I was snooping around the New South Wales National website today, and I was encouraged to see that you guys have a policy when it relates to water and building more dams. And it says on here we need more water infrastructure. And it goes on to say, for too long, inner city bureaucrats and environmentalists stood in the way of building dams, which are widely considered to be one of the best ways to get through droughts on a dry continent. The Nationals in government will cut through red and green tape and deliver critical water infrastructure projects, including new and expanded dam projects. So that's music to my ears. I completely support that. I think water is a massive issue here in this country, obviously. Do you have much faith that the Nationals can apply that pressure to a coalition government and we can see more dams built?
we have in the past, to be quite honest. I think the last major upgrade that was done in New South Wales was Pindari Dam, which was actually opened by a Labor minister, Kim Yaden, I think it was, years ago. But it was funded and put in place by the previous National Liberal Party government. And yes, we've always had a focus on dams, and I think in the last government we were about to commit to, or had committed to, maybe I can't quite recall, but to the construction of a Mole River Dam, which is up near Tenterfield, which was going to contribute to the flow on the McIntyre and ultimately the Barwon and the Darling. But of course, what happens with some of these big projects when they're announced is that the first thing that Labor do when they get it back into government is to stop it. Wangler Dam was to be raised by 10 metres, which was going to virtually double the capacity of it on the Lachlan River near Cowra, and as soon as Labor got into government, they stopped that. Simply didn't proceed with it, and that's what they do all the time to regional communities. You know, the tunnel under the Blue Mountains federally had been funded by the previous federal government. And as soon as Albanese got into power, they stopped that. So half the roadworks are done between Lithgow and Hartley there. Lithgow, and do you know where the lolly factory is, just at the foot of the Blue Mountains? Well, there's all that new roadwork that's happening between Hartley and the lolly factory that was to be the entranceway for the new tunnel. So all that roadwork's been completed, but now there's no tunnel. So yeah. Again, you know, I think it's imperative, and I'm sure that it will happen once the coalition federally is back in power. They'll make that happen again.
Yeah, well, I work in construction. I'm a surveyor, and there's big concern in the industry at the moment that we have Labor governments federally and state, because the last time we had a state Labor government in New South Wales, there was no infrastructure projects, and Correct. It looks like the work's going to be drying up. There's still work on the books for the next 2, maybe 3 years, but after that, it's not looking good.
No, it's not looking good. Yeah, and the problem there, Steve, too, is that when those projects get stopped and the whole infrastructure industry, if we can call it that, slows down, it takes years then to kickstart it again, doesn't it? To do all of the planning and all the prior works before you put a bulldozer in there.
That's right, and they build these projects in stages. So the one that you're talking about is the first stage before the eventual tunnel project. Same thing on the project that I'm working at the moment with at the Warringah Freeway, upgrading it to eventually be able to have the Beaches Link tunnel. It's would be wonderful for the Northern Beaches community, in my opinion. But I mean, a lot of the tunnelways at the openings that they're building are just going to sit there if we're going to have a Labor government, because they're never going to build that. No way.
No, that's right.
Yeah,
and that's been happening for years, for decades. That sort of problem has existed with once the government changes to Labor, they stop all these big projects, and I don't know what they do with the money, but it doesn't come our way most of the time.
No, it doesn't. I don't know what they do with it. But look, I want to discuss one thing. And as I said, I'm on the Northern Beaches. I'm surrounded by teals. I'm in Zali Steggles electorate. Up north is Sophie Scamps. Down south is Allegra Spender. I've got Kalia Tink nearby. Thankfully, her electorate's getting wiped out. So hopefully we'll see the last of her. But what we saw was in 2019, Zali Steggall was the first teal elected, and then the next election comes around, the teals expand and go after more seats, and they have more success. Well, I read an article the other day that the upcoming election, they're planning to go after 30 odd federal seats, and they're not going to be just confined to Sydney seats or coastal seats. Now they're going to be targeting some rural seats, like Cowper's one of them. That they're going to go after around, Coffs Harbour and Nambucca and, those sorts of areas. Also, Colless, now that Andrew G's an independent, they'll be targeting him. How do you feel about the encroachment of the teals in electorates that were traditionally national party electorates?
Yeah, it's a good question. And look, I think what's happening is that with those teals, even though they put themselves across as nice people, that you can vote for and feel comfortable about. But what have they actually done since they've been in power, since they've had those seats? Have they made a contribution to the overall development of the Northern Beaches, or have they in fact helped Labor retard the development of the Northern Beaches? And I think that's the question people have got to understand, is that, and it gets back to you need a certain number of seats to form government. And if one's minor group takes some of those seats, for example, let's say in the federal parliament you need 76 seats in order to form government. So if the Teals win 5 seats off the coalition, that means the coalition's only got 71 seats, Labor's got 76. So Labor forms government.
Mm.
And the Teals don't really have any power then, because the government doesn't need them because they've got the 76 seats, and the Conservative people miss out altogether. They're not represented properly.
Well, I mean, a lot of their policies impact rural communities as well, as we've been speaking about with the wind farms and the solar panels and all that sort of stuff. I mean, do you think these communities like Cowper and Colless will wake up to the Teals and the agenda that they're pushing?
Well, there was a Teal in both seats in the last federal election, and I think the Teal in Colless, from memory, got about 20% of the vote, the primary vote, and it might have been higher than that in Colless, in Cowper. So Cowper's going to be a real issue for us to make sure that Pat Conahan there gets re-elected for the Nats, because she's got a certain following in that Cowper electorate. So she'll get as much funding as she needs if Simon Holmes à Court funds them again, which he did last time. And they had millions of dollars in most cases.
I wrote an article in the Spectator about it, where you can actually go on the AEC website and see what they've disclosed on how much they've spent, and some of them spent over $2 million. How does any party compete with that?
And we can't match that. Can't hold a candle in the wind to that, so to speak, because most of our funding comes from private donations and fundraisers and things like that, and we're always working hard to raise enough money in order to fund an election, and we do get some public funding, yes, but so do they. So that's not an issue. That's pretty much equal. You get so many dollars per vote that you get at each election. But when you have people, the billionaires that are coming in and funding them, and you've got to ask the question, why is Simon Holmes à Court so keen to fund these Teals? What's he getting out of it personally? And he's involved in the renewable energy game, as we know, as is Mike Cannon-Brooks and Twiggy Forrest and some of these other people that are putting a lot of money into some of these candidates. So what's their payday all about? People accuse us of getting support from mining companies and that sort of thing, which we do get some, but nothing like the sort of money that those Teals got. Not in the same order of magnitude.
Well, if you were in the renewables game, to give a big donation to a politician that was favourable to you would be an investment, I would think.
Yeah, exactly. Exactly, and it makes you wonder just how much they're making out of it, and we've all seen our electricity bills go through the roof over the last 18 months or so. So where's that money going? And you've got to ask the question. Well, a lot of it is going into the subsidies that ultimately go back to the Simon Holmes à Courts of the world. Mate,
that's the only renewable part about it, is the subsidies.
Yeah, that's right.
But look, when I drove up to Oberon, and I know we're talking about that, but that's where I met you. I was blown away with the state of the roads and the infrastructure around some of these communities. I really don't know how they put up with it. And then I said to one of the locals, with all these windy roads, narrow roads around the area, how are they going to get these wind turbines up onto the ridge to because we've seen how long they are and how hard it is to transport them. And they said, well, they're going to build a new road. So it's all right to build a new road for a renewable project, but you can't build a road that's going to benefit the community. So I guess to finish up on the National Party, what can you tell listeners? What are maybe some of the plans to build up rural and regional areas that the National Party have planned?
Look, when we're in government in the state, we had a program called Stronger Country Communities, and those funds that we were looking at funding small projects up to $1 million, let's say, for country communities to upgrade their local halls, their sporting fields, all those sorts of things. There was a component of that same fund that went into regional roads, and there was a lot of money spent on regional roads over the 12 years that we were in government. And as soon as the government changed, they remove all that funding again. And from a federal perspective, most of the big road jobs like the Pacific Highway upgrade and things like that are funded under a coalition government. They're funded to 80% by the feds and 20% by the states. Well, as soon as Albanese got into power, he reduced that to 50% by the feds and put 50% of it back on the states. So, and that happens every time the governments change. So I'm pretty sure that Peter Dutton and David Littleproud were looking very carefully at that road funding model to reinstate that 80% funding for major road projects that will be done by the feds and only 20% from the state. That was the reason that the tunnel under the Blue Mountains was cancelled. That they pulled that 80% funding out.
Wow. Well, mate, you've blown me away. This was a fantastic interview, in my opinion. I'm going to play a little game with you now. It's called Build Your Own Fantasy Government. Now, the idea, Rick, is that you're going to be in charge of the next Parliament of Australia, and you can choose 5 or 6 people, and they could be living or dead. They don't necessarily have to be politicians. They can be anyone at all. But you're in control of the next Parliament. So 5 or 6 people to head up the next government of Australia. Who do you choose?
That's a big question, Steve. Living or dead? Well, from the Nationals' perspective, I'd have to say that Blackjack McEwen would probably be one of them, because he never took a backward step in front of a Liberal Prime Minister, and he was a very strong advocate for the bush. I guess my second choice then would be Ian Sinclair, former Deputy Prime Minister also, who was a bit like that as well. He never took a backward step. In fact, I went to Ian Sinclair's 30th anniversary party in Canberra many years ago. And Kim Beazley was the leader of the opposition at the time. And Kim got up in his speech to Ian and said, well, there are whole herds of rhinoceros around the world wishing they had a skin as thick as Ian Sinclair's. It was very funny. But Sinclair was a bloke that had an unbelievable intelligence. He's still alive, by the way, Ian Sinclair. I saw him not so long ago. Unbelievable intelligence, and he could remember debates and things that happened in the Parliament going back years. And he'd be in the middle of a debate, and he'd turn around to one of his advisors and say, in 1978, there was a debate on blah, blah, blah. Go and find the words to that. I need to refer to that. And he had that sort of a memory. He was amazing. Yeah. And he did an enormous amount for regional New South Wales. I can remember him saying years ago that the New England Highway up through the New England area of New South Wales, and he was a member for New England, was better than the road up the coast. And it was. And the reason for it was that Ian Sinclair lobbied to get funding for the New England Highway to bring it up to a standard where it was a safe road to travel from Sydney to Brisbane on. So they'd be probably 2 of the ones that I'd definitely put in that. How many do you want? 5.
Oh, it doesn't have to. I mean, I said 5 or 6, but it doesn't have. I mean, if you think 2 is enough, then.
Well, I think 2 would be a good start. I'd need to do a bit more thinking about the other 3 or 4 maybe, but certainly Blackjack McEwen and Ian Sinclair would be very high on that list.
And what do you think they would think of the jokers that are in there now?
Well, I don't know what Blackjack McEwen would think, but I suspect he would be horrified at what's going on. And I know that Ian Sinclair is also horrified because I did talk to him about that stuff not so long ago. So.
Yeah. Well, look, Rick, I really appreciate it. You gave us some really good information. That's soil information I'm going to be passing around to a lot of the community groups that I'm involved with as well, because there's some big questions about that. And I think that you explained it, tremendously well. And maybe we can reach out to you ongoing to get some more information from you, just so we can formulate those arguments better, because you don't hear about this sort of stuff.
No, you don't.
These arguments don't come up, and I think they're incredibly important. So
thank you, Steve, also for showing an interest in this. And as you say, I know that it's very important that people get their mind around it, because if they don't, and we proceed down this path much further, it's going to have a pretty serious impact on us all eventually.
Now, for people that are listening, and they might be in the country or regional and rural communities, how can they put their hand up for the National Party and be involved in the National Party, or simply just follow what the National Party is doing? Well,
I think if you, for a start, do what you have just done today, and that is go on the National Party's website and just find out what is going on. But if you live in regional areas, there's more than likely a National Party branch in your area somewhere. Certainly there would be in all the major towns and cities across regional New South Wales. Make contact with your local National Party member if you have one, or if you're in an area where there is no National Party member, there'll be a branch there somewhere that you can contact, and you'll be able to get those details off that website, and certainly make contact with them. Go and talk it over with them. There's no, they'll ask you if you want to come along to a meeting to discuss your issues or voice your concerns about what's happening. And we've had a lot of people come to us like that over the years, where we've solved issues for them, and eventually they end up joining a NATS. And we've now got some of those people in some of our administrative positions as local chairs and people that are working hard to make sure we do keep our National Party members in government.
And that's excellent. And talking to you off air, you said some of your pre-selections are already sorted out. So you have candidates on the ground already campaigning, which I think is tremendous.
We do. We've had 4 pre-selections so far. We've still got 3 or 4 to go. 2 of them one was for Pat Conahan in Cowper. The other one was for Barnaby Joyce in New England. So they're continuing. Mark Colton, who was the member for Parks, he's resigning or retiring at the next election after 17 years in the position. And we've pre-selected a gentleman by the name of Jamie Chaffee in Parks, who comes from Gunnedah. He's quite well known across the bush. He's currently chair of the Country Mayors Association. He's the mayor of Gunnedah and chairs the Country Mayors Association. So he's pretty well known around the traps. And the other one that we've pre-selected for is Colless, and we've pre-selected a member of the Legislative Council who comes from Bathurst, Sam Faraway. He's been pre-selected for Colless, and he's already out on the ground campaigning to see if we can win Colless back.
Awesome. That's amazing. I wish the Liberal Party could learn a few tricks from you guys, because we're still waiting for a pre-selection here to happen in Maringa and also Mackellar to the north. But look, mate, it's been an absolute pleasure today. I've really enjoyed this. And as I said, I'm going to be sharing some of the information that you presented here today. And look, I encourage anyone that's watching, please, I say it every single time, share, share, share. Don't just rely on me to be able to share this stuff out, because I'm useless when it comes to social media and those sorts of things. But look, this information needs to get out there. People need to hear this stuff. It's these renewable projects in particular. I know we talked about a lot of things today, but these renewable projects get painted as these wonderful, beautiful green energy nirvanas, and when you do scratch beneath the surface, it's not like that at all. So the stuff that Rick put forward today, I think is very valuable. So please share it out. Sign up to the newsletter at commandingthenarrative.com, and we'll see you all next time. Thank you very much.
Thanks very much, Steve.